Humanity held the launch codes to erase an empire from the stars. They never used them. That sentence sat in the Meridian Concorde's public record for 6 years before anyone outside the Terran Compact understood what it meant. By the time this story is over, you will too. Lieutenant Envoy Senator Okoye had never known a galaxy without the Concorde. Hi. She had been born the year her mother's ship came home from the founding vote, and she had grown up hearing that vote described the way other children heard fairy tales. A door opening, a species stepping through it, a future beginning. She did not remember any of it. She only remembered growing up in the shadow of people who did. As she sat, now in seat 447, in the back row of the Assembly Dome, 22 years after that door had opened. 22 years, and the Terran Compact still sat in the same row. Not because the row had moved, because it hadn't. The Assembly Dome was built from a living crystal that some long-dead architect species had grown rather than constructed. Heart, and it curved overhead like the inside of a shell, refracting starlight into slow-moving bands of color across thousands of delegates. Fenlarin diplomats preened iridescent feathers in the tiers reserved for elder species. The Kale representatives clicked their crystalline limbs together in soft rhythms that passed for applause. Every species had a place that reflected how long they had been trusted with one. Humanity's place was the back row. Sina had asked her mother once why that was, her mother, who had spent 9 years of her life building, something Sina wasn't allowed to ask about, had only said, "It isn't personal. It's arithmetic. They've been counting our years since before we could count theirs. We are new. New things sit in the back until they prove they belong." Sina had accepted that answer. For a long time she was beginning, this particular morning, to stop accepting it. The Meridian Concorde itself was 4,000 years old, founded by 3 species so ancient that their homeworlds no longer existed in any recognizable form. In that time it had absorbed war and famine, and first contact and betrayal, and it had survived all of it by building rules, endless, layered, meticulous rules, until the rules themselves became a kind of gravity, pulling every new species down into the same slow orbit the old ones had already settled into. Sena's professors at the Compact's Diplomatic Academy had called this stability. Her mother had called it something closer to inertia, wearing a formal robe. Humanity had arrived at the Concorde's gates 22 years earlier with nothing but a single relay ship, a handful of treaties translated on the fly, and a species-wide fear so large it had taken most of a generation to speak of it honestly. The galaxy they had found was not the one anyone on Earth had imagined lying beyond the stars. It was old, it was crowded, and it measured trust the way geologists measured stone, in layers laid down over centuries, one on top of the last, until the ones on the bottom were forgotten entirely. Permand, the Drascian Ascendancy delegation entered the dome the way they always did, unhurried, unbothered, trailing a silence that other species made room for out of habit rather than respect. The Ascendancy had held territory across 4 spiral arms for longer than most species had known fire. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. When a Drassian representative spoke, entire fleets moved without another word being said. The Ascendancy called humanity a nursery species. They did not know that a nursery species had, 11 years earlier, quietly finished a shipyard that no sensor in the Concorde had ever detected. High, near the front of the dome, a delegation of Orinth elders, beings of slow, deliberate movement whose species measured political change in decades rather than days, watched the proceedings with the patient, Unhurried attention of creatures who had outlived 17 empires and expected to outlive the ascendancy too. They did not laugh when Kelrin spoke. The way old things watch young things, make the same mistakes their predecessors made. Awed and said nothing, because saying nothing had kept them alive for longer than most species had existed at all. Ascendancy called the Orinths silence irrelevance. They did not know that the Orinth had learned, centuries ago, that the quietest room in any assembly is usually the one still deciding what to do. Administrator Voss Kelrin took the speaker's floor that morning, wearing the pale grey sash of the Ascendancy's Labour Directorate, and he did not raise his voice either. He didn't need theatrics. He had numbers. Members of the Concord, he said. The Ascendancy wishes to report a routine matter of trade compliance. Last translator rendered his voice smooth and administrative. The voice of a man reading a shipping manifest. The joint settlement of Larkspur Hollow, human and Ashling population, 6,211 registered residents, has accrued an unpaid resource tithe across 11 fiscal cycles. Per Ascendancy trade law, ratified by this Concord under the Outer Boundary Accord 400 years ago, a non-payment converts the settlement's population into labor obligation until the debt is discharged. He said it, the way another man might report a delayed shipment. Enforcement teams will arrive within the week. Nobody gasped, nobody stood. In a room built to hold 4,000 years of diplomacy, 6,211 names did not even slow the agenda. Asina's hand went up before she decided to raise it. The arbitrator, a column of contained light that spoke for no species and served all of them, turned toward the back row with something that might have been surprise. The representative from the Terran Compact wishes to be recognized. A ripple moved through the dome. Not hostility, just mild communal amusement, the kind directed at a child who has wandered onto a stage built for adults. Administrator Kelrin's compound gaze found her. It held no anger. That was somehow worse. A compact is, of course, welcome to observe, he said. Though I confess I am unsure what a delegation of 41 vessels intends to contribute to a matter of interstellar trade law. A soft, clicking laughter moved through the Ascendancy's allies. A permanent, the Dovenal delegation, long-time trade partners of the Ascendancy, who had ridden 4 centuries of prosperity on the back of the Outer Boundary Accord, made a low droning sound that passed among their kind for genuine amusement. Their senior representative leaned toward a colleague and murmured, just loud enough to carry, that the compact should be grateful anyone had let them speak at all. Even a few neutral species tilted their heads in the universal gesture for, oh, how sweet. Asina lowered her hand, not because she had nothing to say, because she had learned, in 22 years of watching her mother's generation, absorb exactly this kind of contempt without flinching. That some battles are not won in the moment they are offered. The Ascendancy called Larkspur Hollow a debt. They did not know that the Terran Compact had been quietly repaying debts of its own for 11 years. Debts owed to no one but the people who had trusted humanity to be ready when the moment finally came. The session moved on. Territory was reorganized. Trade lanes were redrawn. The fate of 6,211 people occupied 90 seconds of a 4-hour agenda. And then the Concord adjourned for the day exactly on schedule, the way it always did, the way it had for 4,000 years. The Ascendancy called the Terran Compact silence, proof of weakness. They did not know that in the Compact's own internal reports, that silence had a name. Hi, it was called Doctrine 7, and it had one rule, repeated at the top of every classified briefing Senna had never been cleared to read. Let them believe the quiet room is empty. Senna walked back to the compact's cramped delegation offices alone, past the tiers of species who had stopped noticing her the moment the session ended. Her aide, a soft-spoken records clerk named Priya Vantel, was waiting with the day's correspondence, and one look at Sina's face told her everything she needed to know about how the session had gone. They laughed again, Priya said. It wasn't a question. They always laugh, Senna said. Heart, it's not the laughing that bothers me anymore. It's that nobody in that room, not one delegate, looked twice at 6,211 names before moving to the next item on the agenda. Heart, she sat down heavily at her desk, staring at nothing in particular. My mother used to say, the galaxy doesn't run on cruelty. It runs on speed. Nobody has time to be cruel on purpose. They're just moving too fast to notice what they're stepping on. Priya didn't have an answer for that, neither. Yet did Sina that night, alone in her small quarters. Senna allowed herself something she never permitted in front of Priya, or the Concord, or anyone who might report it back to a compact leadership, still watching to see whether Naledi Okoye's daughter could carry the weight her mother had carried. She sat on the floor with her back against the door and cried quietly, for exactly as long as it took to stop. And then she washed her face, straightened her uniform, and did not mention it to a single living soul. Her mother had done the same thing. She would learn much later, in the same small quarters, more times than anyone in the Compact's official history would ever record. The next morning, she was once again simply Lieutenant Envoy Okoye, seat 447, back row. She did not know, not yet, that in 19 days everything her mother had spent a career refusing to explain to her would finally make sense. Larkspur Hollow did not know it was already gone. Miriam Osi had built her hydroponics dome with her own hands 9 years earlier, back when the settlement was still mostly canvas shelters and hope. Now, it fed 400 families across 2 habitat rings, and on the morning the enforcement ships arrived. She was up before dawn, checking nutrient lines the way she checked them every morning, humming a tune her mother used to sing on Earth, half a galaxy and one whole lifetime away. She was 34 years old. She had 2 daughters, ages 6 and 9, who were still asleep in the dome's east wing. She had an Ashling neighbor named Tulvarius, who traded her fresh eggs for tomatoes twice a week, and who could not, biologically understand the concept of lying, which made him the most trusted accountant in the settlement. She did not know any of this would matter to anyone beyond her own 4 walls. I did. Larkspur Hollow was, by the standards of the outer boundary, an unremarkable place. It had a single market street, a school with more students than desks, and a joint council made up of 3 humans and 2 Ashling elders who argued, amicably, about irrigation schedules more than anything else. Tulvarius had lived 2 domes down from Miriam, since before her youngest was born. He stood a head shorter than her, with soft grey feathered ridges along his forearms and a species-wide inability to process deception that made him, without exception, the settlement's most trusted keeper of accounts. He did not understand why the humans found this funny. Miriam had tried twice to explain sarcasm to him. Both times he had simply blinked slowly and asked her to please not do that again. 2 domes over from Miriam's, a young Ashling couple named Sorrel and Kep Variets, no relation to Tull, a hominant, Aisling naming conventions were a source of endless confusion for human newcomers, had just registered the hatching of their first clutch 3 weeks earlier. Larkspur Hollow had held a small celebration. Half the settlement had come, humans and Aislings both, hide. And Miriam had brought a tray of something her daughters called space pancakes, made from grain that grew nowhere on Earth but tasted, if you closed your eyes, almost like home. And none of that mattered to the Ascendancy's ledgers. A settlement was a settlement. A debt was a debt. The Ascendancy Enforcement Fleet did not announce itself with weapons fire. How? It announced itself with paperwork, a broadcast repeated on every frequency the settlement's receivers could reach. Read in the same flat administrative cadence Administrator Kelrin had used in the Assembly Dome. Labor obligation converted, population reclassified, compliance mandatory, resistance will be treated as further accrued debt. Miriam's dome had no weapons. Larkspur Hollow had no weapons. It had irrigation systems and schoolrooms and a communal hall where the settlement held its founding day dinner every year. And none of that had ever been designed to survive a fleet. Hayaju. The enforcement teams moved through the settlement with the calm efficiency of people, cataloging inventory. Families were separated by labor classification, not by household. Miriam was designated agricultural. Tier 2, her daughters were designated dependent, held at the settlement school, under Ascendancy supervision, pending reassignment review. High. She did not scream. She had read enough intelligence briefings, smuggled quietly through compact channels over the years, to know that screaming changed nothing, and that compliance bought time, and that time was the only currency she had left to spend on her daughter's behalf. Sorrel and Kep Various were designated agricultural, Tier 1 and Tier 3 respectively, a split across different processing lines before either of them understood what was happening. High. Their newly hatched clutch was designated dependent, same as Miriam's daughters, and moved to the settlement school under the same flat administrative language that had already stopped, sounding like anything human or Aisling had ever spoken to another living creature. Hull, Tulverius, who could not lie, and therefore could not pretend to the enforcement officer standing in his doorway that he understood or accepted any of this, simply said, "This is wrong," in the same even, factual tone he used to report a shortfall in the settlement ledger. And the officer recorded his objection, filed it as noted, and moved him to agricultural, Tier 2, beside Miriam. She did not know it yet, but the second transmitter buried beneath her own hydroponics dome had already sent its signal 3 systems away. Somewhere out past the edge of everything she could see, someone was reading it. She was wrong about one thing: time was not the only currency Larkspur Hollow had. It simply hadn't been spent yet. Administrator Kelrin did not personally attend the seizure. He reviewed the compliance logs from his office aboard the Ascendancy cruiser Long Ledger, 3 systems away, the way he reviewed every operation in his directorate, thoroughly, without cruelty, and without particular interest. He had overseen 41 labor conversions in his career. He believed, with the total sincerity of a man raised inside a system 400 years older than his own grandparents, he was preventing something worse. Debt unpaid was chaos deferred. Chaos deferred always came due with interest. He had seen what happened to territories that let obligations go unenforced. He had seen the wars that grew. In that soil, he was not a cruel man. He was a product of an old machine that had convinced itself, generations ago, that cruelty administered evenly was simply order. Kelrin had been born on a Dracian world that, 3 generations before his birth, had itself been rebuilt out of ruin left by an older, hungrier empire, one the ascendancy had eventually replaced. His grandmother had told him stories when he was young about the chaos before the ascendancy's law had arrived. Raiders, failed harvests, whole cities that starved because no central ledger existed to move surplus grain to where it was needed. The ascendancy's tithe system. In the version of history Kelrin had grown up believing, part was not a chain. It was the thing that had ended the chains that came before it. He had joined the Labour Directorate at 19 believing, with his grandmother's voice still in his ears, I was maintaining the machine that kept true chaos from ever returning. Nobody in his 41 prior operations had ever asked him to imagine the machine from the inside of someone else's dome. But he had never once visited a settlement after a conversion. He had never sat across from a mother explaining to a 6-year-old why she would not be coming home that night. He processed outcomes. He did not witness them. That distance was the entire architecture of the ascendancy. Han Kelrin had lived inside it, so long he mistook the walls for the horizon. What he did not know, what almost no one in the ascendancy knew, was that Larkspur Hollow's communications array had a second transmitter, buried under the hydroponics dome, built into the settlement's foundation. 9 years earlier, during construction, the ascendancy inspectors had cleared without a second look. It had been sending a single silent signal since the moment the enforcement fleet dropped out of transit space. Somewhere else, that signal had just been received. Seno Koi learned about Larkspur Hollow's conversion 4 hours after it happened, from a report so brief it fit on a single data slate, a population reclassification complete. No casualties reported, matter considered resolved per outer boundary accord. No casualties, as if 6,211 people losing their names to a Labour ledger did not count as a casualty of anything. She requested an emergency session of the full Concord. The request was routed, as all such requests were, through the Office of Assembly Procedure, an institution so old that its rules predated the written language of at least 11 current member species. A reply came back within the hour, polite and utterly immovable. Request received. The next available emergency session slot, per Assembly Bylaw 9C, is in 11 weeks. Matters of trade compliance are not eligible for expedited scheduling under current procedure. The Terran Compact is encouraged to submit written testimony for the record. 11 weeks. Sina read the reply 3 times, certain she had misunderstood something. She hadn't. She went, over the following 6 days, through every layer of the Concord's bureaucracy that would agree to see her. A deputy arbitrator's aide told her, not unkindly, that the outer boundary accord was 4 centuries of settled law and could not be reinterpreted on the strength of one incident. A Fenlorin trade liaison told her, with what seemed like genuine sympathy, that the ascendancy's compliance record was, unfortunately, entirely within its treaty rights. A junior clerk in the Office of Assembly Procedure, a small-scale functionary who would not meet her eyes, told her that the fastest path to a hearing was a formal grievance co-sponsored by 3 member species with full assembly standing, and that the Terran Compact, lacking full standing of its own, could not initiate such a grievance alone. Every answer was correct. Every answer followed the rules exactly as they were written. And every answer meant that 6,211 people would remain classified as Labour obligation for at least 11 more weeks, possibly far longer, while a 400-year-old machine ground slowly through its own procedure. Haino. On the fifth day, Senna finally reached the Concorde's Historical Compliance Registry, a windowless records division 3 levels beneath the Assembly Dome that almost no delegate ever visited. There, an aging Fenlerin archivist named Osvarel, sympathetic but bound by the same rules as everyone else, pulled up the Ascendancy's full enforcement record under the Outer Boundary Accord without being asked twice. 409 conversions in 400 years. An average of one settlement, one population, every 11 months for 4 centuries, each one processed exactly the way Larkspur Hollow had been processed, correctly, legally, and without a single emergency session ever convened in time to stop it. Nobody's ever won one of these before an 11-week window closed, Verrill told her quietly, glancing at the door before he said it. Not once, not in 400 years of record. On the 6th day, Sina tried one final avenue, a direct appeal to the Concorde's Judiciary Compliance Office, a body technically empowered to issue emergency injunctions outside the normal assembly calendar. A judiciary clerk who received her, a meticulous, not unkind Kale official named Ithran Hather, reviewed her petition for the better part of an hour before delivering his verdict with what seemed like genuine regret. The injunction power exists, he told her, but it has only ever been exercised 11 times in the judiciary's history, each time requiring unanimous consent from all 3 founding species. I would need at least one of them to agree to review your petition on an expedited basis, and I regret to inform you that none of the 3 has responded to a judiciary request in under 6 months in over a century. He slid the untouched petition back across his desk. I am sorry, Envoy, I believe you. I am simply not permitted to act on believing you. Permant. Sina thanked him because there was nothing else to do, and left the judiciary office with the last realistic door in the Concorde's official machinery closed quietly behind her. Sina had grown up believing that cruelty looked like Administrator Kelrin's calm compound eyes. She was beginning to understand that it more often looked like a scheduling calendar, stacked 409 settlements deep. But procedure was not the only thing moving quietly through the Concorde that week. Senna thought, more than once that week, of a briefing she had read as a cadet about the Verin Assembly's harmonization crisis a few years earlier, a fight fought not with fleets but with a single sentence repeated until an entire council could no longer pretend not to hear it. Our language survives, the Terran and Ashling delegation there had said 3 times, until a hall of 12 elder species finally listened. Senna had not understood back then how a species won anything by refusing to raise its voice. She was starting to understand it now. On the 9th day, a courier from the Compact's own archive division arrived at Sina's office with a sealed data core and a message that carried no explanation, only an authorization code she recognized from her mother's old files. The code unlocked a single line of text. It's time she knew. No, Naledi Okoi. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. The message was time-stamped from before that, held in the archive against a trigger condition Sina had never been told existed. She opened the data core alone in the middle of the night and did not sleep again until she had read all of it. What the data core held was not a weapon. It was a ledger of its own, 9 years of it, piled in absolute secrecy by a division of the Terran Compact that officially did not exist, cross-referenced with contributions from 2 other species that had never once been mentioned in any Concorde record. The Terran Compact had not spent its 22 years in the back row doing nothing. It had spent them building the lattice. The Lattice was, at its simplest, a hidden logistics and communications network, 214 relay platforms disguised as debris, mining equipment, and abandoned survey stations, strung invisibly across the outer boundary territories the Ascendancy controlled. Heart. It had been built one relay at a time over 9 years by engineers who told their own families they were working ordinary supply contracts. Some of them had kept that secret for the entire length of the project. One engineer, according to the log, had died of natural causes without ever telling his husband what he had actually spent the last 6 years of his life building. His name was Desmond Achebe, and the personnel file included a single line his supervisor had added after his death, a kind of note that was never meant to be read by anyone outside the division. Asked every single briefing whether the relays would ever actually be used, or whether we were building a monument to a war that would never come. I told him I didn't know. I still don't hope, wherever he is, that he does now. Sina read that line twice and had to set the data slate down for a moment before she could continue. Desmond's husband, a schoolteacher on a colony 3 systems from Earth, still believed his partner had spent the final years of his career installing communications buoys for a mining consortium. He would learn the truth eventually in a formal letter from the compact that Sina herself would help draft. 6 months after Larkspur Hollow, thanking him for a sacrifice he had never known he was making. Lattice did one thing extraordinarily well. It let the compact see in real time every labor conversion the Ascendancy carried out across the outer boundary, and it let 3 species, who had every reason to distrust each other, coordinate a response without the Ascendancy ever detecting a single transmission. Humanity had not built this alone. The Data Core made that unmistakably clear. 2 Fenlarin logistics clans, quietly disillusioned with their own alliance to the Ascendancy, had contributed encrypted relay technology the compact could never have developed on its own. A scattered network of freed Ashling laborers, survivors of older conversions, hidden across a dozen systems, had spent years mapping Ascendancy labor routes from the inside, a risk none of them had ever been ordered to take. Sina's mother had not built a fleet. She had built a coalition, one quiet, dangerous relationship at a time. With species the Concord's seating chart insisted, the compact had no standing to speak to. Files told her how it had started 9 years earlier. A Fenlarin logistics captain named Ira Dallo Priam's own sister, Sina would later learn, had quietly approached a human trade envoy at a minor commerce summit, having grown tired of watching her clan's couriers ferry Ascendancy cargo to labor processing stations she had begun, privately, to refuse to think about too closely. A human envoy had been Naledi Okoye. Their first meeting had lasted 11 minutes and produced no formal record at all. Their second meeting had lasted 3 years, in pieces, across a dozen quiet channels, and had produced the first 30 relays of the Lattice. The Ashling contribution had come differently and cost more. A freed laborer named Cor Various, freed not by rescue but by simple attrition, aging out of his labor classification after 31 years of service, had spent the last decade of his life mapping every Ascendancy conversion route he could reconstruct from memory and second-hand testimony, passing the information through 3 intermediaries before it ever reached a human hand. He had died 2 years before Senna opened the data core. His name appeared in the log 14,000 times. Was a second file in the core, smaller than the first. It was a simple registry. The names, ages, and last known locations of every person converted under an ascendancy labor tithe across the past 9 years that the lattice had been able to track. 617 entries. Sina scrolled to the most recent one. Osei, Miriam, age 34, Larkspur Hollow Agricultural Tier 2. Beside the entry was a single unresolved flag. No extraction attempted. Until now, beneath the registry, one file remained. A short recorded message, video only, time-stamped 4 years earlier, in the final weeks before her mother's death. Sina had not been ready to open it. Until now, her mother looked older in the recording than Sina remembered her, tired in a way she had never let show in person. "Hi, if you're watching this," Naledi said, "it means the trigger condition was met. It means the lattice is needed, and I'm not there to explain it to you myself, so I'll explain it now." She paused, choosing her words the careful way she always had. When we built this, people asked me the same question every time. Why build something this large and never use it? Why spend 9 years and every favor I had left in me on ships we might never fire? I told them what I'm telling you. The point was never to win a war. The point was to make sure nobody could ever force us into one on their terms again. Doctrine 7 isn't about hiding. It's about choosing for ourselves when strength gets used and what it gets used for. The day we let someone else make that choice for us, the day we use everything we've built just because we finally can, that's the day we become exactly what we built it to stop. Hond. She looked directly into the recorder, the way she used to look at Senna across the kitchen table when something mattered. Hi. Whatever's happening when you watch this, I trust you to remember that. Win the moment. Don't win it by becoming the thing you were fighting. The recording ended there. Sina did not sleep that night. She spent it instead composing a message to a coalition she had not known existed 12 hours earlier. Using authorization codes her mother had left for exactly this moment. To people who had been waiting 9 years for someone in the Compact's next generation to finally pick up what the first generation had built. The Ascendancy had spent 400 years believing that silence meant nothing was there. They were about to learn otherwise. 19 days is not a long time measured against a life. It is a very long time, measured in labor shifts. Miriam counted them the way she had learned, long ago, that people in difficult situations always eventually learn to count things, not the days themselves, which blurred quickly into a single grey shift repeated, but the small proofs that her daughters were still safe. A meal delivered on schedule, a guard who let her wave to them across the compound fence once, for 11 seconds before moving her along. She did not know about the lattice. She did not know about her own settlement's buried transmitter, or the coalition it had summoned, or the 19-day countdown already quietly running somewhere far beyond her sight. She only knew how to get up, report to Agricultural Tier 2, and get through one more shift. Hard. But something had changed in the settlement's rhythm by the 12th day, something too small to name and too persistent to ignore. Enforcement officers checking their instruments more often, attention in how quickly orders were given, as though everyone administering Larkspur Hollow's captivity had started, without knowing why, to feel watched. Various noticed it too. "Something is coming," he said to Miriam one evening, across the narrow gap between their processing stations, in the flat, incapable of exaggeration tone that made everything he said impossible to dismiss. "I do not know what, but something is coming." Fleet Marshal Priam Dallo had commanded the Fenlorin Shadow Logistics clans for 11 years. heart, and in that time she had grown almost fond of being underestimated. Her people were small-framed, feather-crested, built for speed rather than intimidation, hardened, and the Ascendancy had spent 4 centuries treating Fenlarin ships as couriers rather than combatants. Now that mistake had kept her fleet alive through 3 quiet conflicts the wider galaxy had never heard about. When Senna Okoye's message reached her flagship, authenticated with codes Priam had not seen used in 4 years, she read it twice, then called her command deck to full readiness without explaining why. Larkspur Hollow, she told her second, a Kale officer named Rethic, whose crystalline body clicked faster when he was anxious. The lattice is going active. All of it. Rethic's limbs clicked hard, all 214 relays. At once, the Ascendancy will notice the moment they'll notice, Priam agreed. That's the Sena arrived aboard Priam's flagship 6 hours before the operation. And the 2 women spoke alone for the first time in the same small briefing room where, 9 years earlier, Priam's sister and Sena's mother had first laid out what would become the Lattice's founding plan. Your mother and I disagreed about exactly one thing in 9 years, Priam said, studying the tactical display without quite looking at Senna. She always said the day would come when we had the strength to end the Ascendancy outright. And when it did, we should walk away from that option anyway. I told her. That was a beautiful idea that would get us all killed the first time it was tested. And now it's being tested, Senna said. Now it's being tested. Priam finally looked at her. So tell me, Envoy, your mother isn't here to make this call anymore. Are you going to make her call? Or are you going to make your own? Sena thought of the 617 names in the registry. She thought of Miriam Osi, agricultural tier 2, no extraction attempted. She thought of a scheduling calendar, 409 settlements deep, and of Doctrine 7, a hand of a woman on a recording telling her not to become the thing she was fighting. We free every settlement we can reach, Sena said. I show them exactly what we could have done instead. And then we let them live with knowing we chose not to. That's not weakness. That's the whole point of building something this large, and only ever showing them the edge of it. Priam studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, the Fenlarin gesture for agreement reached. Your mother's call, then. Good, it was the right one 9 years ago, too. 19 days after the seizure of Larkspur Hollow. At a coordinate, the Ascendancy had never once flagged as significant 31 ships from 3 species that had never publicly acknowledged working together. Dropped out of transit space, in perfect formation around 6 separate Ascendancy labor processing stations, simultaneously across 4 systems. It was not the largest fleet the galaxy had ever seen. It did not need to be. It was the fleet no one had known existed, arriving everywhere it needed to be at once. And that was its own kind of thunder. At a processing station orbiting a scorched mining world called Tesserae's Rest, 400 light-years from Larkspur Hollow, a compact frigate, crewed jointly by human and Ashling volunteers, cut the station's labor classification network with a single coordinated signal, freeing 2,900 laborers who had, until that moment, believed their debt would outlive their children. At a third site, a joint Fenlarin-Ashling strike team disabled an Ascendancy transport convoy mid-route, redirecting 1,100 laborers back toward the nearest neutral world before Ascendancy Command even finished confirming the attack was real. Fourth, the smallest of the operations, a single compact courier ship slipped into a remote holding facility and simply opened every door. Because the facility's entire security staff had already fled the moment the Lattice's presence became known across the sector. Aboard the frigate at Tesseri's Rest, a young Ashling engineer named Perrin Ossel watched the station's classification network go dark on her console and, for a moment, simply stared at the readout instead of moving to the next task. She had trained for this operation for 2 years, without ever quite believing she would run it for real. Her crewmate, a human logistics officer named Farah Delgado, had to say her name twice before Perrin blinked back into motion. 2,900, Perrin said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. We just did that, 2,900, all at once, save it, Farah told her, not unkindly, already moving to the next console. Rut. We've got 3 more relay clusters to confirm before this is over. At the smallest of the 4 sites, the lone compact courier pilot, a 19-year-old flight cadet named O.C. Mann, on his first assignment since graduation, no relation to Miriam despite the shared name. A coincidence, the mission log noted with something close to amusement. Walked through an abandoned holding facility, calling out in 3 languages to make sure no one was left behind, before he sealed the final door open and radioed back a single word: clear. It was the shortest report filed that day, and Fleet Marshal Priam Dallo would later say it was her favorite one to read. None of these operations fired a shot that killed anyone. All 4 had been rehearsed in simulation more than 60 times over the preceding 2 years, by crews who had trained for a mission they were told might never actually happen. At Larkspur Hollow, the Long Ledger's sensors registered the arrival with a full 9 seconds of confused silence before anyone aboard understood what they were looking at. Administrator Kelrin was on the bridge when the alert came through. He did not at first believe the identification the sensors returned. The Terran compact vessels, Fenlorin ShadowClan configurations his intelligence division had insisted, did not exist. Ashling crewed transports, flying colors that belonged to a species with, officially, no armed presence anywhere in the galaxy. That is not possible, he said quietly to no one. It was possible. It had simply never been visible. Grand Warden Osterval, commanding the Ascendancy's outer boundary defense fleet from 3 systems away, arrived at Larkspur Hollow 40 minutes later with 11 capital ships, expecting to find a settlement in disarray and a handful of overmatched compact vessels to scatter. Instead, he found his own labor processing station surrounded, its shield generators disabled without a single shot fired, and Fleet Marshal Priam Dallo's voice, waiting on an open channel the moment his ships arrived. Grand Warden, she said, your station is inside our formation. Your shields are down. Your fleet is outnumbered 4 to 1, and every ship in that number has been waiting years for this exact moment. On one of Osterval's escort ships, a young weapons officer's hand hovered over a firing control for 2 full seconds, 2 seconds that, on the Long Ledger's bridge, felt to Kelrin like the longest silence of his career, before a superior officer's sharp order pulled the hand away. Nobody outside that bridge would ever know how close the entire operation had come, in that single moment, apart to becoming something none of the Coalition's rehearsals had prepared for. Osterval's translator carried something close to a snarl. You will regret this insolence, Fenlorin. The Ascendancy does not negotiate with. We're not negotiating. Asena's voice cut in, calm, steady, transmitted from a compact vessel positioned at the formation's center. We're informing you, every laborer registered under an active Ascendancy tithe within Lattice reach is being released. Right now, across 4 systems, whether you fire on us or not. Only decision left for you to make is whether your fleet survives the next 10 minutes. High. There was a long pause. On the Long Ledgers Bridge, Administrator Kelrin watched the tactical display with an expression his crew had never seen on him before. He thought, in that silence, of the 41 operations behind him. 41 settlements, processed correctly, exactly as the law required, and not once, not a single time, had he considered that somewhere in the shadows past his sensor range, a species he had called a nursery might be counting alongside him. 409 conversions in 400 years. He wondered, distantly, how many of them the Lattice had watched happen without the strength to stop. 4-1, Osterval finally said, and his voice had lost some of its certainty. Heimmort, you would risk full engagement over laborers. We could destroy your fleet in the next 10 minutes. Arsena said, we have the position. We have the numbers. We have had 9 years to plan exactly this moment. And I promise you, Grand Warden, ending your fleet was on the list of options we considered. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. We're not going to do that. Somewhere on the Long Ledgers Bridge, Kelrin's compound eye narrowed almost imperceptibly. You are outnumbered exactly enough to run, Senna continued. Harmony. Not enough to fight and win, that's not an accident. We didn't come here to erase the ascendancy. We came here to make sure it never does this again. I withdraw your fleet, release every claim on Larkspur Hollow, and every settlement like it within Lattice reach. Bring these terms to the Concord within 30 days, or the next fleet you see from us won't leave room to negotiate. Osterval was silent for a long moment, weighing odds that every instrument on his bridge confirmed, and every instinct trained into him for 30 years refused to accept. And if I choose to fight anyway? He asked finally. If I decide 400 years of ascendancy doctrine is worth more than 11 ships, then you'll lose your fleet and we'll still free every laborer in this system, Senna said. The only variable you control right now is how many of your people go home tonight. That's it. That's the whole equation. The choice laid bare was almost insulting in its simplicity. Osterval had 11 ships and no possibility of victory. He had, for the first time in 400 years of ascendancy military doctrine, an opponent who could have annihilated him and had chosen, deliberately not to. He gave the order to withdraw 8 minutes later. On the ground at Larkspur Hollow, Miriam Osei was still in the agricultural Tier 2 processing line when the settlement's public address system crackled to life with a message that was not from the ascendancy. It took her a full minute to understand that the labor classification markers on every worker's wrist had simply stopped functioning, all at once across the entire compound. Hermant. She found her daughters 20 minutes later at the settlement school, exactly where they had been left, both of them unharmed, both of them asking where she had been. She did not have an answer that would make sense to a 6-year-old. She held them instead, in the dust outside the classroom door, for longer than either of them wanted to be held. And neither of them complained. 2 domes down, Sorrel and Kepvarius found their clutch exactly where the school record said it would be. All 7 hatchlings accounted for, and Tull Varius, released from agricultural Tier 2 within the same minute as Miriam, walked the length of the settlement afterward, simply touching things. The market stalls, the irrigation lines, the door of his own dome. He did not say anything about it to anyone. And being Ashling, he could not have pretended otherwise even if he had tried. He was, for the first time in 19 days, simply relieved, and he let it show on his face exactly as it was. Administrator Kelrin filed his final report on the Larkspur Hollow operation 4 hours after the withdrawal order. And for the first time in his career, he did not classify the outcome as resolved. He classified it in the small space the Ascendancy's forms reserved for administrator notes as unprecedented. Then he sat alone in his quarters aboard the retreating Long Ledger for a long time, turning over a question his training had never prepared him to ask. What kind of empire spends 9 years building a fleet capable of ending you, and uses it only to make you stop? He did not have an answer yet. He would. Eventually, word of the Larkspur Hollow operation moved through the galaxy faster than any Ascendancy news office could contain it. A small species who had spent centuries quietly obeying the Outer Boundary Accord out of fear began asking their own councils, for the first time in living memory, whether obedience had ever actually been required by law, or only by habit. 2 minor systems formally requested contact with the Terran Compact within the week, unprompted, citing the Larkspur Hollow operation by name. On a dozen worlds the Ascendancy had never expected to hear the words spoken aloud. People began repeating a phrase that had, within days, stopped belonging exclusively to humans. The quiet room was never empty. The Concord's emergency session convened, in the end, not in 11 weeks, but in 11 days, because an empire that 400 years of member species had treated as untouchable had just been forced to withdraw from sovereign territory by a coalition the Assembly's own seating chart insisted did not have the standing to act. Sena Okoye stood before the full dome, no longer in seat 447, but at the speaker's floor where Administrator Kelrin had once described 6,211 people as a matter of trade compliance. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, finally, that she didn't need to. 400 years ago, this Concord ratified an accord that allowed one species to convert entire populations into labor because a ledger said they were owed a debt. She said, 11 days ago, an alliance this assembly never knew existed, proved that the only thing actually owed here was an apology, 4 centuries overdue. She let that sit, one sentence alone. In the silence, the way her mother had taught her, without ever quite explaining why. How? My mother spent 9 years of her life building something she hoped she would never have to use. Sena continued. She used to tell me that strength only means something if the people who hold it can be trusted to put it down again. I didn't understand that for a long time. I understood it 19 days ago, watching 11 Ascendancy warships choose to withdraw instead of fight, because they finally understood we meant exactly what we said. We are not here to punish the Ascendancy. We had the fleet to do it, and we chose not to. We are here because no one owns another's tomorrow. She said it again, quieter. No one owns another's tomorrow, and once more, so that even the delegates in the farthest tier would carry it out of the dome with them. One owns another's tomorrow. Before the vote, the Orinth elders, who had watched Kelrin's announcement in silence, weeks earlier, rose to speak for the first time in longer than most delegates in the room had been alive. Our eldest representative spoke slowly, each word deliberate. We have watched 400 years of this accord in silence, because our way is to watch before we act. We watched a species this assembly called a nursery choose restraint when it held every advantage. That is not the behavior of a young species. That is the behavior of a species that has already decided what kind of elder it intends to become. A chamber, for once, had no laughter left in it for the back row. Aha. The Concord voted on the Terran Compact's proposed reforms to the Outer Boundary Accord 6 days later. Every Labour tithe currently active across Ascendancy territory would be reviewed and, in the overwhelming majority of cases, dissolved. Future conversions would require full Assembly ratification, not unilateral ascendancy declaration. And the Terran Compact, along with the Fenlarin Shadow clans and the Ashling coalition that had spent 9 years building the lattice in total secrecy, was granted full Assembly standing. Seats moved forward, out of the back row, for the first time in 22 years. Not every voice in the chamber welcomed the reforms. A senior Ascendancy fleet commander named Vesek Thorn, who had built his career on 4 decades of tithe enforcement, rose before the vote to argue that the Accord's dissolution would invite exactly the chaos the tithe system had been built to prevent. "Jaime, you mistake restraint for weakness," he told the Assembly, his voice tight with something closer to grief than anger. The Ascendancy did not build 4 centuries of order by accident. Dismantle it, and you will not like what grows in its place. Aha. Nobody laughed at him, and nobody dismissed him outright either. Several delegates from smaller species nodded slowly, unconvinced but unwilling to pretend. The question was simple. Asina did not have a clean answer for him. She only had Larkspur Hollow and Tesserae's Rest, and a registry of 617 names that had waited far too long for anyone to test whether order and cruelty were actually the same thing. The vote was not close. Even the Ascendancy's own representative cast her vote in favor, her hands visibly unsteady as she did. Hald. In the months that followed, Fleet Marshal Priam Dallo's shadow clans were formally recognized by the Concord for the first time in Fenlarin history, and no longer forced to operate as couriers hiding a truth their own alliance had never wanted to hear. Rethic, her anxious second, was given command of his own vessel, and according to Priam, clicked his crystalline limbs so hard with pride on the day of his commissioning that 2 junior officers asked if he needed medical attention. Heartless, the scattered network of freed Ashling laborers who had spent a decade mapping conversion routes in secret were given, for the first time, a name in the official Concord record, the Core Various Registry, after the man who had started it and never lived to see it matter. Administrator Vos Kelrin resigned from the Labour Directorate 4 months later. He did not explain why in any official record. He simply requested reassignment to a small trade office on a minor world, where, for the first time in his career, he would meet the people affected by every decision he made. His first week in the new posting, an elderly Ashling farmer came to his office to dispute a tariff assessment on a grain shipment. Kelrin sat across the desk from her, close enough to see the calluses on her hands, and found that he could not process her file the way he had processed 41 Labour conversions, as a line item, a number, a matter resolved. He spent 40 minutes on a decision that should have taken 4, because for the first time he understood that every number in every file he had ever signed had belonged to someone who could, if he let them, sit across a desk from him and simply be a person instead of an entry. He kept a printed copy of the Larkspur Hollow registry in his desk drawer. After that, not as evidence, but as a reminder of the distance, he never wanted to build again. The Grand Warden Osthavel was quietly retired within the year. Fleet Commander Vesek Thorn was not. The Ascendancy, in the middle of an uneasy transition, still needed officers who understood the old doctrine well enough to help dismantle it responsibly. Alan Thorn, to the surprise of several delegates who had expected him to resign in protest, accepted the assignment, Miriam Osei rebuilt her hydroponics dome within the year, this time with a small brass plaque beside the door that no one but her family understood the significance of. It read simply, 19 days Priya Vantal, Sena's Quiet Records clerk, was promoted to lead the Compact's newly formed Outer Boundary Liaison Office, tasked with reviewing every one of the 409 historical conversions the ascendancy had carried out under the old accord. It was slow, unglamorous work, cross-referencing names, tracing families across generations of displacement, reuniting what could still be reunited. And Priya did it for the next 11 years without once complaining that it was not the kind of work anyone wrote songs about. She kept a small tally on her office wall instead, updated by hand of every reunited family. High. By the time she retired, the number had reached 1,143. Larkspur Hollow held its next founding day, dinner with 6,211 names read aloud, one at a time, a tradition that continues to this day. 3 years after his resignation, Administrator Kelrin was invited, by Miriam Osei herself, in a message he read 4 times before he believed it was genuine, to attend that dinner as a guest. He accepted, uncertain, until the moment he arrived, whether he would be welcome or simply tolerated. Tulvarius greeted him at the door, and being constitutionally incapable of anything but honesty, had told him plainly that many in the settlement still found his presence difficult. Kelrin said that was fair, and that he had not come expecting forgiveness, only to listen to 6,211 names in the same room where he had once signed the order that gave them numbers instead. He stayed for all of them, beyond Larkspur Hollow. The reforms Sena's coalition had forced onto the Concord floor rippled outward for years. The Outer Boundary Liaison Office, Priya Vantal, led eventually traced and reviewed labor obligations tied to all 409 historical conversions, a process that took the better part of a decade and freed, in total, populations the final report would only ever describe in careful, unglamorous administrative language. Obligation dissolved, review complete. No parade marked the day the report was filed. Nobody expected one. That, Sena had come to understand. How was rather the point of the whole 9 years that had made it possible. 8 years later, a small girl named Nuru Osei, born free, in a settlement her grandmother had once been classified out of, stood at the edge of Larkspur Hollow's memorial garden, a heart where a monument shaped like an open hand reached toward the sky. Patrol ships from the Compact's now public defense fleet passed silently overhead on their regular rounds, no longer hidden, no longer secret, simply present, the way a promise kept quietly becomes, eventually, just a fact of daily life. Nuru's teacher had asked the class that morning what the monument meant. Most of the children had shrugged. Nuru had not. "It means someone was watching," she said, "even when nobody knew they were there. And when it mattered, they didn't need to be loud, they just needed to be ready." Her teacher, who had once been a lattice engineer and had kept that secret from her own family for 6 years, had to turn away for a moment before she could speak again. Hanuru's grandmother, Miriam, still ran the hydroponics dome, though her hands moved more slowly now than they had 19 days once demanded of them. The war. She kept the brass plaque by the door polished, and every year on founding day, when 6,211 names were read aloud, she listened to every single one, the way she always had, the way she always would. Far away, in the assembly dome, seat 447 sat empty in the front tier now, a small marker beside it, noting for any delegate curious enough to ask that it had once been the very back row of a very old room. The Concorde kept it that way. On purpose, some things it had finally learned were worth remembering exactly as they were. Hi, that's where Larkspur Hollow's story ends. But the lattice is still out there, and there are 596 more names on that registry we haven't told you about yet. Heart, if you were in Administrator Kelrin's position, trained your whole life to believe a ledger justified everything, do you think you'd have recognized the moment to walk away? Hi, or would it have taken 9 years of watching ships you never knew existed to teach you? Hi, tell us in the comments. If you want to know what happens to the other 596 names, and what the Ashling Coalition finally asks the Compact for in return for 9 years of silence, subscribe now. That story is coming next, and it changes what you think you know about who really built the lattice. Hide, and if you haven't seen how the Verin Assembly fought to save a language instead of a fleet, go watch that one next. It happens in the same galaxy, not long before this story begins, and by the end of this series, you'll see exactly how the two connect.